I'm New York Times Metro reporter Jeff May sitting in for Sam Roberts. This week, New York under pressure. Today, we look at two separate crises impacting the future of our city. I'll talk to a New York Times data reporter about the city's childcare industry, which is not only pushing families out of New York with its rising costs, but also barely compensating the ones taking care of our kids. But first, we follow up on the migrant influx that continues to challenge New York. More than 100,000 migrants have entered the city in the past year, and according to our mayor, the ongoing crisis may not end well. In order to relieve some of the strain on city services, Mayor Adams' solution has been to bus migrants upstate, a region that has been suffering from population decline. The approach has area employers looking forward to an opportunity to fill much-needed jobs. But unfortunately for them and our state, politics are standing in the way. Jesse McKinley covers upstate New York for The Times. He joins us now from Albany. Welcome to the show, Jesse. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the situation upstate. What's happening that there is a labor shortage in the first place?
Well, I think it's a continuing trend line for decades that there has been kind of out migration in a lot of upstate cities or stagnant population. Buffalo is kind of an outlier in that it has seen a little bit of a bump, but by and large, upstate New York has seen people drain away. Pretty much since the closing of the Erie Canal. And that has caused not only aggravation for employers, but also concern, amongst local leaders who see their tax bases dwindling, businesses shuttering, etc. And COVID accelerated that, honestly. A lot of people either left the workforce or left the areas. And so with the migrant influx, there has been somewhat of a silver lining for some of these employers who see, a capable able-bodied workforce sitting in New York City that they would love to utilize.
And it seems like there's a political issue here, though. While employers are calling for more workers, some of the county executives, for example, have been reluctant to accept incoming migrants. How are they dealing with that controversy there?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, particularly at the beginning of this crisis, when people began to show up in New York City, Mayor Adams' solution for that was to bus some of them to neighboring and even farther flung counties with very little notice. And I think it was a communication problem to a large extent where because the mayor didn't give them any heads up, people would simply arrive on buses, they would be warehoused in hotels and low rent motels. And that took people by surprise and angered them. And that was across the aisle. There were Democrats that were upset about this, some Republicans in suburban counties. And that agita led to a lot of lawsuits, a lot of executive actions. And that irritation, as it were, with Mayor Adams has not subsided, even as business owners have said, hey, this might be an opportunity.
And immigrant labor, it's not new to upstate New York, right? You talked to one farmer, I believe, who ran his entire operation almost with immigrant labor, but even he was reluctant for some reason to include new migrants in that.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying here, to an extent, is a political schism. A lot of these rural areas are more conservative; they tend to vote Republican. Obviously, downstate is a more Democratic area. New York City is the Democratic bastion, and I think there's a little bit of irritation that Democrats in the city are sending migrants up to upstate areas where they don't believe in the politics, and they certainly don't believe in the policies, not only of Eric Adams but of President Biden. So you are seeing a little bit of schism there as well. I'd also mention that in areas like Utica, Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo, those are big cities which are very accustomed to refugee populations in particular coming in every year and integrating into those communities and oftentimes revitalizing neighborhoods that have been kind of knocked low by economic decline.
Siena College recently did a poll on this issue. Are we seeing that schism reflected in the polling data?
I think you're seeing concern. Yeah, I think what Siena found was that a lot of people were concerned about this issue, that they felt like maybe too many people were arriving in New York City, and that the solutions offered were not completely satisfactory. You and I and a lot of Metro reporters have done reporting in recent weeks about this, the work permit issue. There is kind of a extensive wait if you're an asylum seeker, 180 days from the time you file your application for asylum before you can get a work permit. And that's really been an issue that Governor Hochul has been upset about, that federal leaders, congressional leaders in New York have been upset about, that it takes too long to get these people on their feet in terms of work. And a lot of them want to work. But federal law at this time does not permit those work permits to be issued. And so that's caused some real agitation as well.
Now, if I'm a migrant, I come into New York City, what's the process if I were interested in trying to find work upstate? How would I go about that? Are there people to help? Are there people giving leads and other assistance?
I mean, certainly the Biden administration offered a background briefing this week that basically said, look, we're going to try to get boots on the ground in New York City in terms of presumably lawyers and other sort of support staff to kind of guide migrants through this process. They added that a lot of people that are already on the ground in New York City could potentially have work permits, but they simply haven't filed the paperwork. And keep in mind that if you're coming from a place like Honduras or Guatemala, perhaps your English is not good or non-existent. This can be a very daunting process. It can be a very legalese process, and also there's obviously fears of law enforcement, I think, in some areas as well. So it's not an easy process, but I think the government is trying in so much that they can to ease the way, but we'll see if that works.
And you talked about the delay in getting work permits, but I think it's clear from my own reporting and that many migrants are already working on the black market. What are some of the pitfalls of that happening as opposed to a sort of legalized process that Mayor Adams has been calling for?
Well, they're myriad. Obviously, you don't want people working in the black market. There's no worker protections. There's potential for exploitation. And from a governmental standpoint, you're not getting any taxes off these people, and you're also not able to kind of track them and potentially provide social services to them if they need them. So when people start to fall into that kind of chasm of illegal work and illegal jobs, it presents a challenge not only for the people themselves who might be doing jobs at below minimum wage or being exploited in this way or that, but also for the government to try to address whatever needs they need, whatever needs they have.
And New York has welcomed over 100,000 migrants since the spring of 22, but this is not the only place where this is an issue, right? This appears to be happening in other democratic, mostly cities around the country, right?
Yeah, and some of this is politics, obviously. California has seen, Los Angeles in particular, has seen busloads of migrants and asylum seekers being sent from Texas, which of course is led by Greg Abbott, a Republican. Obviously, Ron DeSantis made headlines last year by, flying a bunch of people to Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts as kind of a political stunt. So this is an issue that I feel Republicans feel is a very potent one, potentially in this election cycle, and particularly next year, a presidential election cycle, akin to what they did with crime in 2020 and 2022 when they really hammered the Democrats on those issues. So obviously, with all of these things, there are policies and then there are politics, and there's a lot of both being bandied about in this moment.
And I know Governor Hochul has faced criticism from Mayor Adams and others for not doing enough. One of the things Mayor Adams asked the governor to do was to sort of stop counties from passing executive orders to prevent migrants from being busing there. What's been the governor's response to this crisis in terms of getting work permits?
I think it is not unfair to say that the Hochul administration was caught a little flat-footed by this. I think in the initial weeks of this, they didn't quite have a response. I think a lot of county leaders that I talked to were very aggrieved. They felt like the governor was not giving good guidance. I think they've gotten up to speed. I think she's poured some money on the situation, which of course is kind of Albany's solution to a lot of problems. But they've also tried to, work with the Biden administration, find solutions, and potentially even use some sort of state work permit to bypass the federal work permit, of course, with some sort of exemption from the Biden administration. So they're trying to find solutions, I think, at this point, realizing that first off, they did not respond perhaps as perfectly as they would have wanted to in the initial weeks, and now also recognizing that it is a humanitarian crisis, and as I said before, a potential opportunity.
And Governor Hochul recently spent a couple of hours talking to President Biden's chief of staff about this issue. She said her main request was the work permits. Does President Biden have the power to waive what I believe it's a 180-day requirement before you can get a work permit? Does President Biden have the power to waive that and make that happen more quickly?
The short answer is no. I mean, it's a federal law. It is something that would require an act of Congress. And of course, with a divided Congress, Republicans leading the House, that is unlikely to happen. And I think, once again, to go back to the politics of this, that is what has frustrated, I think, some Democrats in New York, and probably nationally when they look at the political map, is that the Biden administration hasn't been able to do much. The Biden administration, to their credit, says, look, we can't, our hands are tied, we are looking for other sorts of solutions. There are humanitarian ways of kind of getting around this, to kind of temporary work permits, but those are very limited, and they can be cumbersome, and they would probably face legal challenges as well. But to go back to the politics just one last time, I think for Democrats, they feel that Biden should be more forceful about making the point that if the Republicans really want a solution for this, they should get back to work. They should pass a law. He'll sign it, and that'll help with the problem. And I think the Biden administration in the last couple of weeks has gotten more aggressive about this, and probably will continue to, and say, look, this is not a problem created by Democrats alone. Republicans have a hand in this, and they have to have a hand in the solution as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering, is there a political risk for Republicans in this position that they've taken to be firmly against work permits and other changes to the immigration?
I'm not seeing a political risk right now, because public sentiment at this moment is very, very much in favor of their belief that, the Bidens have bungled this, and the open borders. You see this again and again in public polling, that the border is an issue, and it is something that galvanizes Republican voters and also sways some independents as well. So it doesn't seem like they're paying a political price for it yet. Now, keep in mind, it's a long way until November 2024. There will be many, many twists and turns before that. And I think if the Biden administration starts to message on this, it is possible that Republicans could be on the back foot eventually. But right now, I think the Democrats are really taking it on the chin.
The New York City Hospitality Alliance and others have called for speeding up work permits, the Partnership for New York. I'm wondering, if the work permits don't happen, do we see a sort of economic impact, a fallout as a result of those changes not being made?
Well, I think, once again, the old saying, in every crisis there's an opportunity, and I think for business leaders, they see this as an opportunity, as I said before. So I think their frustration will continue to grow if they can't get the work permits accelerated, and that if a lot of these people who are actually eligible are not given work permits, I think you're going to see, calls from the private sector get louder and louder. Even a few weeks ago, Jamie Dimon and a bunch of business leaders from Wall Street said, "Look, we gotta get this fixed." So when you start to see those types of people, those kind of high-level corporate leaders, say we've got a problem, that tends to be something that catches the attention of political leaders, not only in the state but also nationally, because of course they are not only corporate leaders; they tend to be donors. And I think if there's not a solution, it may not have an immediate economic impact, but it will certainly have there will certainly be people in the economy, major leaders in the economy, making a lot of noise about this.
Jesse, thank you so much for your reporting and this informative piece. We look forward to more from you on this vital issue to New Yorkers. Coming up in our next half, childcare and its many discontents. We'll be right back. Childcare is failing New York City. The skyrocketing cost is pushing the city out of reach for all but the wealthiest of families. And even those who are getting paid to look after our kids are struggling to get by. According to our next guest, the model is becoming unsustainable. Helping sound the alarm this week with a New York Times article that has gotten a lot of attention online is data reporter Asmaa Elkeurti. Asmaa dug into the numbers that tell the story of our city in decline. Welcome, Asmaa.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks for coming on. Now, you're a data reporter at the New York Times,
Yes.
and I'm wondering, what were some of the surprising numbers you saw when you actually dug into the childcare crisis in the city?
Well, childcare is really expensive. The average rates for daycare centers and even home-based care are so high, and yet childcare workers are being paid wages that just aren't livable in New York City. So you have this big disconnect, and it really shows that the system is pretty fragile. Daycare centers operate on pretty thin margins, which was exacerbated by the pandemic when a lot of parents obviously were keeping their kids at home.
Right. And now you and Eliza Shapiro, who you wrote the story with, you talked to a number of parents. Now, this is not just an issue that's affecting low-income parents, right?
Right, yeah, it affects New Yorkers across the board. So, I mean, what you're paying for childcare depends on where you live in the city, and where you live in the city also might affect your median income. And we found that certain boroughs were especially childcare burdened, which is measured by how much of your income goes towards childcare. And the Department of Labor actually did a county by county analysis of childcare burden across the US. And they actually found that the Bronx was one of the most burdened counties in the entire US. In 2018, families were spending 47% of their income to pay for average costs of childcare. Like, the cost of childcare in that area would have taken up nearly half of the area's median family income.
And that's much greater than what is recommended
Yes,
your budget
yeah,
for childcare.
yeah. The federal recommendation for childcare costs as share of income is just 7%. But we found that across the city, the average cost of childcare would eat up about nearly a third of a family's income.
That's amazing. You and Eliza talked to a family that made $400,000.
Yeah.
And they were facing childcare difficulties.
Exactly. So again, like, where you live will affect how much you pay for care, and parents tend to look for care centers that are close to their homes. But also, the more you make, generally the more you tend to pay. And the less it makes sense for one person to stay home to take care of a kid. So we published a call out, which the New York Times does from time to time, basically soliciting stories from readers about what they were paying for care and the sacrifices they were making. And we heard from 140 New York families across the income spectrum, many of whom were making well into six figures. And like you said, families that were making $400,000, talking about how they were burdened by childcare costs.
That's amazing. I know my son is almost 9 years old, and when he was born, my wife, who's a nurse practitioner, decided to work part-time because even part-time care costs almost $20,000 a year. And this was several years ago. So I'm wondering, what are families doing to sort of meet these costs that they're seeing?
They're scrambling. They're looking for work accommodations. They're cutting back on hours, which it sounds like you guys did. And they are, they're leaving their jobs altogether. And some families are leaving New York City. And this is especially, cutting back on work, a lot of that is borne out by women. So they're leaving wages on the table, and that also costs the city. The city's getting less in tax revenue and disposable income. That's also less money going towards a business and one less worker at the business where the mother works. So, New York City is also, as a whole, losing out on potential economic prosperity.
Are employers doing anything to help struggling parents out?
Some companies are offering childcare benefits as a perk, but it's not all that common. And even, companies that do offer you a small childcare subsidy have so many caveats attached to it. and it still doesn't really make a dent in the overall issue.
Right. Now, I can imagine, you mentioned the pandemic, how it had changed childcare. People were working from home more. Have things gone back to normal before the childcare, or is the situation exacerbated after the pandemic?
The pandemic really exacerbated the childcare crisis. So it's more expensive. We dug into state surveys that the New York government had done, basically looking at childcare prices in 2019 versus 2022, and we found that day rates for young children especially had gone up like 20%, and those are for daycare centers. And not only that, but the industry shrunk quite a bit during the pandemic. Thousands and thousands of early childcare and education centers closed their doors, and a majority of those were home-based care centers, which tend to service people who might be a little bit less affluent than daycare centers service. And not only that, but childcare workers left the industry. The city lost something like a third of their childcare workers since the start of the pandemic.
I'm wondering what else the data is showing you. Has the data shown, you talked a little bit about women especially leaving their jobs, people potentially leaving the city. Is there any data that sort of shows those through lines? Yeah,
absolutely. There was the Economic Development Corporation did some research that found that in 2022 alone, the city basically lost out on something like $23 billion of basically revenue from taxes and from that were lost from women cutting back on work or leaving their jobs altogether, or families just leaving the city. And also, I mean, there's less GDP, right? If you're down a whole salary, that's less money for you to spend.
Right. You know, the people that take care of our children tend to be women.
Yeah, overwhelmingly.
And so while they're out taking care of other people's children, what's happening with their children? Are they struggling as a result of what's happening?
They're struggling too. It's really affecting New Yorkers across the income spectrum. So childcare workers are one of the lowest paid service workers in the city. The median cost or the median hourly wage for childcare workers is something like, it's less than $16 an hour. And it's worse if you are working at a home-based care center. For home-based care workers, they're making something like $10.50 an hour, or I think it's $10.61 an hour exactly. And that really leaves them with very little to spend on their own children.
Right. And you talked to a home-based child care provider as well, and I believe they closed up shop. Was it because of these sort of economic pressures? What are the costs of running a child care center? Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, child care centers generally operate on like pretty thin margins. So between liability insurance that they have to have and the high ratio of teachers or child care staff workers to children, they're often left with very little after their operating costs. And because they're operating on such a tight margin, the pandemic kind of really exacerbated all of that. And they didn't really have a lot built up to kind of go off of, so they had to shut their doors.
Wow. Are we seeing these workers unionize? Is there a movement towards protecting them in that way?
I think there is a little bit of a movement, but there hasn't been a ton of momentum as far as I'm aware. But I know Eliza Shapiro, who I worked on this story with, she's tapped into that community quite a bit.
Well, I couldn't imagine what we would have done if our childcare center closed.
Yeah.
You're seeing that. What's happening? What does a parent do if they lose their childcare option?
I mean, parents really talked to us about how much they were struggling and how just like the kind of emergency situations that they found themselves in if, you know, their nanny or their daycare center was unavailable for a day. You know, if you're a parent and you already feel like you're taking a lot of time off work because of all of these emergencies, you're cutting back on work, you're still working from home as more and more of your colleagues are returning to the office, and then all of that, a lot of that income is going to pay for this care. Parents talk to us about feeling like they were kind of falling behind at work and not performing as well as they wanted to or their boss wanted them to, and then also feeling like they were falling behind as a parent And then on top of that, not feeling like they had a lot of income left at the end of the day. So you have all of these factors that are kind of, that parents are weighing when it comes to balancing childcare and their careers.
We talked a little bit about employers and what they might be doing. Has the federal government stepped in? This seems like this could be a national issue. I know you focus mainly on New York, but this seems like this is a national issue as well.
It is. And just in the past year, the cost of childcare has risen at double the rate of general inflation nationally. And while it might be more extreme in terms of burden in New York City, it's definitely something families are struggling with across the board. And there were some pandemic era subsidies that the federal government put in place, but those are actually ending this month, which is leaving families and childcare providers even more desperate.
Wow. It seems like that these changes you're talking about could shift the city demographically. What's happening? Do you have a look ahead as to what's happening? Are there just going to be less families with children in the city?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the trends that we found was that families with children under the age of 5 are leaving the city. And we heard plenty of stories about that. You know, people are like looking at a $3,500 a month daycare cost here in New York City, and then they move. One of the people we interviewed in the story, she talked about moving back to her hometown in Cleveland and paying $1,000 a month for childcare, $50 a day. And she didn't want to leave New York City, but she felt like she had no choice. Like they just could not get the numbers to add up for them. And so if New York continues to see families fleeing, I mean, those are fewer people in the city contributing to the economy. And that also, you know, like changes the diversity of the city. You tend to have just more affluent families sticking around. And we found in the data actually that Black families in particular were leaving the city who had children.
And the city, are they making any efforts to help families?
Yeah, so I mean, the city has universal 3K, and they've tried to make it easier for families to apply for the subsidies if they're qualified. But I mean, if you're a family of 4 and you're making like $150 a year, $200, you're not going to qualify for these subsidies. And you know, if you're paying $3,500 a month for childcare, that's still too expensive. And I mean, the mayor has also, you know, talked about stopping the expansion of 3K, which, you know, is a program that New Yorkers love. And there's also been, you know, childcare providers who haven't received payment from the government that they were expecting. So I think, you know, while the government does have a few solutions for families, it's definitely not enough.
Asmaa, thank you so much for your detailed reporting on this
Yeah.
topic.
Thank you,
That's
Jeff.
it for today's show. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jeff Mays, filling in for Sam Roberts. See you again next week on CUNY TV.